The people shown in the picture are now receiving a lot of attention due to the situation in Ukraine. This tall, dark-bearded, heavily armed fighter was trained since his childhood to use knives and firearms. These warriors are known as the Devil's Army, and their brutal torture and assassination methods are notorious for their brutality. They are Chechen fighters. Recently, Russia sent a notorious Chechen army to kill Ukrainian President Zelensky. But we will get to that at the end of the video. First, let's talk about the history of these people and how it came to this point. The Chechen people have had to cope with the very harsh environment, an area that leaves no room for weakness. This is Russia's southwestern border with the Caucasus Mountains surrounded by the Black Sea and Caspian Sea. And on the northern edge of these mountains, at over 5,000 meters above sea level, lies the Chechen Republic. The nomadic Chechen people have been living there for about 6,000 years. However, this region was also a key point in Europe and Asia, and as such had long suffered from different conflicts. Then in the 19th century, Russia, which was then beginning to grow with the Industrial Revolution, chose to colonize everything like Western imperialist powers did. And the Chechen people, who were deeply Islamic, hated the Russian Slavic rule, which was completely different from their way of life and views. Thus, the Chechen people kept their own traditions, beliefs, and religions while refusing to join the Russian Empire. And in the early 20th century, during the Russian Revolution, they fought for the independence. They attempted to flee the colony in the 1917 during the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, but were completely defeated by the Soviet Union in 1921 and incorporated into the Soviet Union. The Lenin government of the Soviet Union gave them autonomy but not independence. In 1936, the Chechens and their neighboring country Ingushetia were merged and proclaimed by the Soviets the Chechen Ingush Autonomous Republic. And during that time, large numbers of these people were killed by Russian forces just to completely take over Chechen. When the Chechen leaders were executed, the Chechen people put up a strong resistance. But Stalin's army killed about 120,000 Chechens or forced them into exile in Central Asia. The angry Chechen people put up fierce resistance to the Stalinist regime, but were nevertheless repressed. At the end of the World War II, there was a brief German occupation of Chechen, and Stalin punished the Chechens for collaborating with the Nazis. As a result, the Chechen Republic was dissolved in 1944, and 400,000 Chechens were deported to either Siberia or Kazakhstan. It is estimated that around 30% of these oppressed migrants lost their lives through planned slaughter or starvation. And this makes the Chechen people very angry. Some Chechens who managed to flee during the first migration hid in the Caucasus and waged guerrilla warfare to retaliate against the Soviet army. And even in these difficult times, around 230,000 Chechens died, almost half of the total population of the Chechen Republic. In 1957, after Stalin's death, the Chechen people were able to return to their hometowns thanks to the efforts of the Chechen people and the reform of the new leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev. But for those who were finally able to return to their hometowns, nothing was left. Not only were they subjected to state discrimination, they were also treated like criminals. After a long time, a Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. The newly created Russia was a multi-ethnic federal state system consisting of 89 federations. And it was during this period that the independent hero of Chechen, Johar Dudayev, appeared. Born in Kazakhstan due to the first migration of Chechens, Dudayev proclaimed Chechen independence along with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. This is how Chechen became independent, and he was elected the first president of Chechen. But Russia didn't stop there. Russia employed an economic blockade policy against Chechen, an attempt to maintain its jurisdiction over Chechen to the end. And there was another reason why Russia could not give up this small Chechen country compared to its very big homeland. Chechen is a very small but valuable place in many ways. Oil produced in Caspian Sea, the world's largest oil field, is shipped to Russia and Europe via Chechen. However, if Chechen becomes independent, Russia will have to pay Chechen an enormous sum in oil pipeline transit fees. Even after a new oil field was discovered in the Chechen capital Grozny, it became one of the three largest oil fields in Russia. Also, especially for Russia, the Chechens were Islamist extremists and terrorists. Russia thought it had to stop this minority separatist movement in order to counteract the collapse of the Russian Federation and protect its own country. Finally, in 1994, Russia invaded Chechen and the First Chechen War broke out. Of course, the Russian army was overwhelming, but the war didn't end easily due to the tenacious resistance of the Chechen people who didn't fear death. The Russian army in particular suffered enormous losses in the Chechen capital of Grozny. More than 100 tanks and armored vehicles alone were destroyed, and around 2,000 Russian soldiers died. In Chechen at that time, not only army soldiers were on the move, but also ordinary citizens armed themselves and sacrificed their lives to repel the Russian army in ambushes and surprise attacks. As a short side info, Grozny means a scary place in Russian. Ultimately, however, the Chechens were unable to withstand the overwhelming Russian army, air force, and missiles. So they lost control of the Chechen capital, Grozny. The defeated Chechen army turned into guerrilla forces and fled to the southern mountains to continue to guerrilla war. But what really reflected the strength and resilience of these people was that most Chechens spread throughout Chechen and continued their guerrilla warfare there, including many suicide bombers. It was also around this time that the Chechen proverb, Chechen men who have never killed a Russian soldier are difficult to marry, came into being. In 1996, after a bitter struggle, the Russian army managed to kill Chechen President Dudayev. But because of the endless counterattacks of Chechens, it was not fully conquered. Finally, in 1996, Russia signed a peace agreement with Chechen and withdrew. The issue of Chechen's independence was postponed until 2001, leading to Russian President Yeltsin being heavily criticized by the Russians. He was seen as an incompetent president who couldn't adequately repress even a single ethnic minority with Russia's mighty military power. But 3 years after the First Chechen War, the Second Chechen War broke out in 1999, which became even more brutal. The reason for this was due to the person who was nominated by Yeltsin as his successor. It was Putin. The background of the Second Chechen War is as follows. Shamil Bashev, an Islamic extremist and Chechen rebel leader, invaded the Russian Federation of the Republic of Dagestan and said he would build an Islamic theocratic state. Russia also launched an attack on Chechen. Meanwhile, a series of bomb attacks took place in residential buildings in Moscow. In just a moment, a residential complex disappeared and more than 300 ordinary citizens died. And at that time, Chechen rebels were proclaimed as the main culprits of this terrorist attack, and the Second Chechen War broke out. The Russian army took over the Chechen capital of Grozny, leaving the entire Chechen territory in ruins. And Russia, which suffered great damage in the First Chechen War, was preparing new tactics against them in the Second War. In fact, the Chechen rebels at that time were divided into two groups, nationalist and Islamic fundamentalist forces, so internal conflict arose. Thus, Russia helped the nationalist forces establish a pro-Russian government. And the pro-Russian Chechen army even helped the Russian army take over the Chechen rebels hiding in the mountainous areas. Eventually, Russia won the Second Chechen War, and unlike Yeltsin, who proved to be weak in the First Chechen War, Putin showed a strong side of Russia. Thus, Putin's popularity rose sharply after the Second Chechen War, which later had a significant impact on his election as president of Russia. However, the Chechen people in whose veins runs the blood of warriors never gave up, and the resistance that followed led to a series of terrorist attacks in Russia. In 2002, a hostage situation took place in the Moscow theater, the capital of Russia. 50 Chechen rebels took spectators, actors, and up to 1,000 hostages and demanded that Russian troops must be withdrawn from Chechen within a week. Eventually, Russian special forces got the upper hand, but not only Chechen army lost their lives, but also 150 innocent citizens. This incident and its background shocked not only Russia, but the whole world, because 18 out of 50 Chechen rebels were Chechen women who had strapped bombs to their bodies and took part in the hostage-taking as a suicide squad. At that time, all Chechen women died after resisting to the end, saying, "Our desire for deaths that we have accumulated over the past 10 years is stronger than the combined will of the hostages to live." And the unbridled anger these Chechen women moved with their suicide squads had good reasons. Having lost their fathers, husbands, and brothers in the war, they had experienced the hardships worse than death, in addition to suffering in the hands of the Russian army, which didn't respect any basic human rights in any way. In this way, Chechen and Russia continued their endless bloody history. Just 2 years later, in 2004, Chechen rebels raided an elementary school in Beslan, a city in Russia, killing more than 300 children and civilians. The attack was carried out by the female military unit, the Black Widows, made up of the wives of Chechen men who died fighting against Russia. During these terrorist attacks, which never ended, innocent civilians suffered the most. That is why the Russian people began to fear the Chechen people. In 2006, the Russian army killed the Chechen leader Shamil Bashev and shattered almost all Chechen rebels. These two wars in Chechen reduced the population of Chechen from 1.2 million to 800,000. But at this point, something strange happened. When war broke out between Russia and Ukraine in 2022, Ramzan Kadyrov, now head of the Chechen Republic, is said to be a close confidant of Putin. Now one wonders, how did the Chechen boss who hated Russia the most end up working for Putin? In fact, during the First Chechen War, Kadyrov fought as a Chechen rebel against Russia. But after his father was killed by a Chechen separatist group, he hated the separatists in Chechen. And then, during the Second Chechen War, he changed his course and joined forces with Russia to attack separatist rebels in Chechen. At that time, Kadyrov, who was well liked by Putin, became president of the Chechen Republic in his early 30s. He later ordered his combat troops to finish up Ukrainian President Zelensky, saying, "Putin made a right decision and we will carry out his orders in any environment." However, the Chechen special forces, which have become Russia's secret weapon, were wiped out before they reached Zelensky on March 1st, when they attempted to kill Zelensky outside of Kiev. Surprisingly, Ukraine already knew about the plans for this operation of the Chechen Special Forces. Ukraine said, "We already knew what special operations Chechen troops would conduct. We received confidential information from representatives of the Russian Federation Security Service who didn't want to take part in the bloody war." And on March 3, anonymous and international hacking group said, it was the Russian Federation Security Agency that leaked information about Chechen troops to Ukraine. However, the withdrawal of Chechen troops does not guarantee Zelensky's safety. Recently, Chechen leader Kadyrov said he was operating with his Chechen special forces in Ukraine. In fact, on March 13, it was reported that Kazarov was recently sighted in Kiev. He says 10,000 Chechens have been deployed to Ukraine, and as many as 70,000 could be deployed to fight. In the current situation, Russia sent mercenaries skilled in urban warfare, and members of the Chechen army and the Russian mercenary group Wagner Group are sent to the front. Meanwhile, Ukraine has about 20,000 foreign volunteers, most of whom are from Europe, including the United States. And the most worrying thing about this situation, while mercenaries are stepping in, is that the Ukraine war could escalate to international fights. What do you think about this video? I'm always grateful to Patreons for their great help in making videos. Thanks for watching. Be safe.